Every week, a lot happens in Parliament. Debates rage, bills are discussed, and laws are introduced. So it's easy to feel like you don't quite know what's going on in the chamber. So we're lifting the lid and telling you exactly what happened this week in Parliament. This week, we saw the return of the Fire Safety Bill to the Commons, questions to the parliamentary organisers of the COP26 Climate Conference, and a 10-minute rule motion on high-performance vehicle renting. In our first story today, we look at the Fire Safety Bill, which appeared in the House of Commons again this week, following amendments that had been tabled by the Lords. You might remember we discussed this bill a couple of weeks ago, and that it covers all kinds of fire regulations, specifically those coming in the light of the tragic Grenfell Tower disaster. 5 amendments to the bill were put forward by the Lords, but only 2 were voted on for a variety of reasons. The first amendment that was voted on was Lords Amendment 2, which Kit Malthouse, the Minister for Crime and Policing, summarised and explained why the government was against it.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Lords Amendment 2 would place in primary legislation several very specific requirements on the owner or manager of a building which contain 2 or more domestic premises. I recognise that many of those in this House and in the other place wish to see legislative change on this as soon as possible, and the Government shares this objective. The Fire Safety Bill is the first step towards this. It was always intended to be a short, technical piece of legislation designed to clarify that structure, external walls and flat entrance doors should be included within the fire safety order, and we need to deliver on this as soon as possible to ensure that fire risk assessments are updated to take account of the risks in those areas. Madam Deputy Speaker, we intend to implement the areas specified in Amendment 2 through regulations, and as such this amendment is unnecessary.
MPs, including Shadow Housing Minister Sarah Jones, were critical of the government for not wanting to address the issue now.
The government said they would implement the Grenfell Phase 1 inquiry recommendations in full and without delay. And the Lords Amendment number 2 would be a straightforward way for the government to fulfil that promise. These measures are straightforward and are supported by key stakeholders. Indeed, a common response is some incredulity that these measures aren't already in law.
Despite a lot of agreement with Jones from MPs, this amendment was defeated 345 to 226, ultimately going the government's way. The other amendment that was voted on was Lords Amendment 4, which Malthouse again summarised and put forward the government's position.
Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, Lords Amendment 4, which seeks to protect leaseholders and tenants from paying for the remediation of unsafe cladding from their building. I should state that we agree with the intent to give leaseholders peace of mind and financial certainty. That's why the government has recently announced it will be providing an additional £3.5 billion to fund the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding targeted at the highest risk buildings. This brings the total investment in building safety to an unprecedented £5 billion.
There was some support for the government's methodical approach, but the majority of MPs spoke in support of simply getting on and passing legislation on such an important issue, including Labour MP Asmana Begum.
The common thread here is to urge the government to ensure that freeholders do not unjustly pass fire safety remediation costs on to leaseholders and residents. Too many of my constituents are living in dangerous homes, facing huge financial and legal liability for remediation of building safety defects, not of their making. Too many are suffering from anxiety and stress from living in blocks with ACM and other types of cladding. Residents have contacted me in despair, devastated that they've been hit with huge bills for work to make their buildings fire safe. Meanwhile, developers such as Bellway and Ballymore have continued to make huge profits thanks to government inaction and privatisation and deregulation of the housing sector.
Again, this amendment was defeated 340 to 225, again going in the government's direction. There was the threat that an additional amendment tabled by MPs in the Commons, which would be similar to Amendment 4 but building on it, was going to deliver a big rebellion against the government. However, it didn't have time to be voted on, so we'll have to keep an eye on what happens from here. For our second story today, we're going to take a look at the first ever round of oral questions, which are questions from MPs to government departments, to those responsible for organising the COP26 conference in Glasgow later this year. COP26 is the latest instalment of the United Nations Annual Climate Change Conference, and answering questions from MPs this week were President of COP26 Alok Sharma and Anne-Marie Trevelyan, whose role is UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for COP26. They were asked a variety of quickfire questions in the half-hour time slot. For example, MPs tabled questions on how climate action will contribute to the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic.
The Northwest, as you're very well aware, is the heart of the UK nuclear industry, including Westinghouse Nuclear Fuels in my constituency. With the world increasingly focused on utilising low-carbon energy sources, what steps is my right honourable friend, the President of COP, taking ahead of COP26 to promote UK-based nuclear energy production?
Nuclear power clearly has a part to play in our clean energy mix, and you will know in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, we've committed to backing large-scale nuclear, and of course the sites like the ones in his constituency are vital in terms of creating jobs and investment in the Northwest.
Public transport is one of the cleanest modes of transport we have by helping to get thousands of carbon-emitting vehicles off our roads. But our public transport infrastructure is woefully outdated in the north of England and simply not fit for purpose. Will you therefore back my calls for the Northern Powerhouse Rail Scheme to be built in full?
I certainly agree that we should be encouraging people to take public transport where that's possible. I come in from Reading to Paddington every day by train myself. He's raised a policy issue relating to the Department of Transport, and I'll make sure that I make representations on his behalf to the Secretary of State.
As you can probably tell, in oral question meetings, the questions and answers are quite short and sharp, unlike some of the other longer debates we cover. Labour MP Clive Lewis took advantage of this, asking Sharma a particularly difficult question, to which Sharma was not particularly impressed.
The UK's credibility as COP president rests on demonstrable climate action at home. And yet, much like the government's failed pandemic response, which has left 130,000 people dead, the government is acting too slowly, prioritising profit over public well-being. The government boasts about road building, cutting $1 billion from the public rail infrastructure budget and allowing the Cumbria coal mine to go ahead. A plan simply not compatible with achieving net zero. So will the minister therefore admit that this government's stated ideological beliefs are incompatible with even its own meagre climate goals?
I always thought that climate action was an area that we could collectively coalesce around without the need for political name-calling and fighting, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be possible for the Honourable Gentleman. I would just point him to the record of this government, but I'd also say to him that over the past 30 years, across a range of governments, in the UK we've managed to grow our economy by 75% and yet cut emissions by 43%. Green growth is possible, and that is what we're pursuing.
Finally, Ed Miliband, in his new role as Shadow President of COP26, asked Sharma about climate budgets and international aid.
Yet the government has shamefully chosen this moment to cut £25 to £30 billion from overseas aid over the course of this Parliament. Now, it says it is protecting climate aid, but it hasn't set out what that means year on year. So can he guarantee today that in this coming financial year, when the COP takes place, there'll be no cut to the level of the UK's climate finance budget, nor to the climate programmes we fund?
What I would say to him is, like him, I'm very proud of the work that successive governments have done in terms of supporting the most vulnerable around the world. But at 0.5% of GNI, the UK will still remain a leading international aid donor. And in relation to the issue of international climate finance, he will know that over a 5-year period, our commitment is 11.6 billion, which is indeed a doubling of the last figure.
For the third story today, we discuss a 10-minute rule motion, something we've talked about before in this series. Very basically, these motions allow backbenchers to present bills without needing government support. As the name suggests, they have 10 minutes to pitch their motion. However, while they're usually approved when they're first proposed, they're normally voted down in future sessions down the line, or simply left to expire by the government. Regardless, the motion we're looking at today relates to high-performance vehicles. Labour MP Holly Lynch used her 10-minute rule motion to try and introduce a law that would put more restrictions on those renting high-performance vehicles, those which exceed 300 horsepower. She outlines the problem at the beginning of her speech.
In recent years, we've seen a rise in cars like Lamborghinis and Ferraris being hired out to someone who goes on to pass the keys to someone else, if not several other people. Vehicles then driven at dangerously high speeds, putting other road users, pedestrians and the driver themselves at risk. Often the driver will not have the appropriate insurance. In a majority of cases, they will not have the experience of handling a 300 plus horsepower vehicle, which we know can be deadly in the wrong hands.
In fact, last year, a rented Lamborghini driving far in excess of 40 miles per hour over the speed limit crashed and set fire, and as a result, both people in the car were treated for head injuries. Ms Lynch attempts to rectify the problem by introducing the following rules for those renting such vehicles.
I'm proposing that all rental vehicles for use on public highways over 300 horsepower will need to be fitted with a black box. A black box is typically the size of a matchbox and records information about how and when a car is driven. The information contained within that black box must be made available to the police on request. The second related change is that a person hiring a car must be insured as the named driver for that specific vehicle for the entire duration of the rental agreement.
In addition to this, Ms Lynch has proposed that a rule be implemented to disallow certain people from renting such vehicles.
Like introducing minimum licensing requirements for those seeking to hire a performance vehicle. That could include things like being of a certain age before you can hire a car over 300 horsepower, a requirement to have a clean licence or have a minimum number of years' experience as a driver.
As ever, the House of Commons got a vote on whether to allow the proposal to proceed. This was done orally, and as you'd expect, hardly anyone voted, meaning that it was able to pass. Ultimately, we'll have to keep an eye on this legislation and see if it ends up going any further, or if the government just lets it die in the chamber, as they so often do. If you want to be updated with what happens in Parliament next week, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Or if you prefer to listen to the weekly update, then you can subscribe to the Daily Briefing podcast feed, where you'll find a daily summary of the week's news events, and every Saturday, This Week in Parliament.